All right, let's dive in. Number 7. Poon Lim, 133 days alone on a raft. On November 23, 1942, World War II is raging, and a 25-year-old Chinese sailor named Poon Lim is working as a steward on the British merchant ship SS Ben Lamont, traveling from Cape Town to Suriname. Then, a German U-boat, the U-172, fires 2 torpedoes directly into the ship. The Ben Lamont sinks in less than 2 minutes. Most of the crew dies instantly, either from the explosion or drowning as the ship goes down. Poon Lim grabs a life jacket and jumps overboard just seconds before the ship's boilers explode. He floats in the water for 2 hours before spotting a small wooden raft, an 8-foot square emergency raft with minimal supplies. He pulls himself aboard and takes stock of his situation. He has a few tins of biscuits, a water jug with about 10 liters, some flares, a flashlight, and a small supply of chocolate. At normal rationing, these supplies might last 2 weeks, maybe 3 if he's extremely careful. Poon Lim is floating alone in the South Atlantic Ocean with no land in sight and no idea when or if rescue will come. Days turn into weeks. Poon meticulously rations his supplies, but they run out, so he does something extraordinary. He adapts. Using materials from the raft, he fashions a fishing hook from a spring in the flashlight, creates fishing line from rope, and begins catching fish. When it rains, he collects water using a canvas tarp. He learns to catch seabirds by hand when they land on the raft, wringing their necks and eating them raw. But the ocean isn't done testing him. One day, a shark begins circling his raft. When it gets too close, Poon grabs it, drags it partially onto the raft, and stabs it repeatedly with a makeshift knife until it dies. He then drinks the shark's blood to stay hydrated because he's run out of fresh water, and he dries the fins in the sun to eat later, a delicacy from his home region of Hainan. Finally, on April 5, 1943, after 133 days adrift, Brazilian fishermen spot his raft off the coast of Brazil. He had drifted over 2,000 miles across the Atlantic. When they pull him aboard, Poon Lim has lost only about 20 pounds and is in remarkably good physical condition considering his ordeal. He spends 4 weeks in a Brazilian hospital and makes a full recovery. When asked about his record years later, Poon Lim said something profound. "I hope no one will have to break it." Number 6. The Tugboat Survivor, 14 hours in an underwater tomb. On May 26, 2009, Harrison Okene was working as a cook on a tugboat off the coast of Nigeria when a massive rogue wave hit the vessel at 4:30 in the morning. The boat capsized so quickly that most of the crew didn't even have time to react. Within seconds, the entire tugboat flipped upside down and sank to the ocean floor, 100 feet below the surface. Harrison was in the bathroom when it happened. The boat inverted, water rushed in from everywhere, and in the chaos and darkness, he found himself trapped in a tiny air pocket about 4 feet wide in what used to be the bathroom but was now an upside-down tomb at the bottom of the ocean. And here's where this story becomes absolutely horrifying. Harrison was stuck there in complete darkness for 14 hours. He could hear the sounds of the ocean around him, the creaking of the metal hull, and worst of all, he could hear his crewmates in their final moments. The sounds of people drowning, trying to escape, and then silence. He was certain he was going to die down there. The air in his tiny pocket was running out. As he breathed, carbon dioxide was building up, slowly poisoning him. The cold water was rising. His body temperature was dropping. He started hallucinating, convinced he could hear rescue boats above him that weren't there. Then, actual rescue divers showed up. A salvage team had been sent to recover bodies from the wreck. When a diver shone his light into the wreckage, he saw what he thought was another corpse. But then the corpse moved. Harrison reached out and grabbed the diver's hand, nearly giving the poor guy a heart attack. The diver's camera captured the moment, and you can hear him yelling, "He's alive! He's alive!" in absolute disbelief. Harrison was slowly decompressed in a diving bell to prevent the bends and was eventually brought to the surface after spending 14 hours underwater, the sole survivor of a crew of 12. When asked how he survived mentally, Harrison said he prayed constantly and tried not to think about the fact that he was 100 feet underwater in a sunken ship with no apparent way out. The human will to survive is absolutely incredible. Number 5. Adrift in the Pacific. 41 days alone after losing everything. This story begins in September 1983. Tammy Oldham Ashcraft and her fiancé, Richard Sharp, were hired to deliver a luxury yacht from Tahiti to San Diego. They were experienced sailors, the weather forecast looked good, and this was supposed to be a romantic adventure before their wedding. Then Hurricane Raymond appeared out of nowhere. This wasn't just any storm, it was a Category 4 hurricane with 140-mile-per-hour winds and waves that reportedly reached over 50 feet tall. On October 12th, the storm hit them with full force. Tammy was below deck when a massive wave struck the boat. She was thrown across the cabin and knocked unconscious. When she woke up 27 hours later, she had a severe head injury, the boat was destroyed, and Richard was gone. The mast had been snapped off, all the navigation equipment was shattered, the engine was dead, and the emergency radio didn't work. The boat was taking on water and barely floating, and Richard, her fiancé, had been swept overboard during the storm and was nowhere to be found. Tammy was completely alone, injured in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, on a boat that was falling apart with no way to call for help. She was over 1,500 miles from the nearest land. Most people would have given up right there. Instead, Tammy did something absolutely extraordinary. She found a sextant that had survived the storm, taught herself celestial navigation using a book that was partially destroyed, jury-rigged a makeshift sail from the wreckage, and began steering toward Hawaii, the nearest landmass she could realistically reach. For 41 days, she sailed alone across the Pacific. She rationed the limited food and water supplies, some canned goods and emergency water that hadn't been destroyed. She battled sun exposure, dehydration, and the psychological toll of being completely isolated on a damaged boat, knowing that the man she loved was gone and that every day she might not make it to the next one. On November 22, 1983, after 41 days at sea, Tammy finally spotted land. She had navigated over 1,500 miles using dead reckoning and celestial navigation, bringing the battered yacht to Hilo, Hawaii. She had lost 40 pounds and was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but she was alive. Tammy later wrote a book about her experience called Red Sky and Morning, and her story was adopted into the 2018 film Adrift. She still sails today, which is honestly incredible considering the trauma she endured. Number 4. Western Port Bay, the 14-year-old who swam through hell. In 1973, a 14-year-old boy went out with his parents and older brother for what should have been a simple afternoon boat trip in Western Port Bay, Victoria, Australia. They rented a small motorboat and everything seemed fine at first. Then they noticed the boat was taking on water. The rental boat, it turned out, was rotted and unseaworthy, something the rental company had failed to mention. The boat sank quickly. The family found themselves in the water miles from shore as night was falling. The father tried to keep everyone together, but the current was strong and the water was cold. They attempted to swim toward a small island they could barely see in the distance. The 14-year-old was a strong swimmer. He made it to the island first, a grueling swim of about 2 miles through increasingly rough water in the dark. But when he reached the shore, he realized the nightmare wasn't over. He was standing in thick, deep mud that tried to suck him down with every step. He had to cross this treacherous mudflat to reach solid ground where he could find help. He spent hours struggling through the mud in complete darkness, exhausted from the swim, terrified and alone. Every step felt like it might be his last as the mud pulled at his legs, sometimes up to his waist, but he kept going, driven by the desperate need to get help for his family. He finally reached dry land and found a house where he collapsed and told them what had happened. Rescue teams were immediately dispatched, but by the time they arrived at the scene, it was too late. His parents and his 16-year-old brother had all drowned. Their bodies were recovered the next day. The boy survived, but he carried the guilt with him for years. He had made it while his entire family perished. Survivor's guilt is a devastating psychological burden, and for a 14-year-old kid who just lost everyone in a single night due to someone else's negligence in renting out an unsafe boat, that trauma was unimaginable. The story led to significant changes in boat rental regulations in Australia, but for that young man, nothing could bring back his family or erase the memory of that horrific night. Number 3. The SS DUMARU, when desperation crossed the line. In the middle of a powerful storm near Guam, lightning struck the SS DUMARU, an American cargo ship carrying high explosives in barrels of gasoline. It was October 16, 1918. The strike ignited the volatile cargo, triggering a massive explosion that tore the ship apart. Most of the crew died instantly in the explosion or drowned when the ship sank within minutes. But about 15 men managed to escape in a single lifeboat. They were hundreds of miles from land with almost no supplies, no food, very little fresh water, and no real hope of being found in the vast Pacific Ocean. Days turned into weeks. The sun beat down mercilessly. Their water ran out, then their emergency rations. Men started dying from dehydration and starvation. Bodies piled up in the small boat, and then the survivors faced a choice that would define them for the rest of their lives. When the survivors were finally rescued by a passing ship nearly 3 weeks later, they told a heroic story of endurance and bravery, of men who died nobly and survivors who persevered through sheer willpower. The newspapers printed their accounts, and they were celebrated as heroes who'd survived against impossible odds. But years later, one of the survivors broke his silence. He revealed what had actually happened in that lifeboat. The men hadn't simply endured starvation, they had resorted to cannibalism. When men died, the survivors consumed their flesh and drank their blood to stay alive. This wasn't about honor or heroism, it was about the absolute extremes of human survival instinct. These men had been pushed so far beyond normal human experience that they'd crossed a line most people can't even imagine approaching. And they'd kept it secret for years because of the shame and horror of what they'd been forced to do. The SS DUMARU incident became one of the documented cases of survival cannibalism at sea, though it was hushed up for decades. It raises uncomfortable questions about what any of us might do in similar circumstances, about where the line is between wanting to survive and what we're willing to do to achieve that survival. The survivors who admitted the truth were ostracized by some and pitied by others, but they maintained that they did what they had to do to see their families again. Whether that justifies their actions is a question philosophers and ethicists still debate. Number 2. The LUXBOROUGH Galley, Fire, Blood, and Desperation. It was May 1727 when the LUXBOROUGH Galley set sail from Jamaica bound for London, carrying a cargo of rum, sugar, and other goods. The ship had a crew of about 30 men, and the voyage should have been routine. Then, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, disaster struck in the worst possible way. A lantern or candle, accounts vary, ignited alcohol vapors that had leaked from broken rum barrels. Within minutes, the entire ship was engulfed in flames. The fire spread so quickly that there was no time to fight it or attempt to save the vessel. The crew had seconds to abandon ship before the flames consumed everything. 22 men managed to scramble into a single small lifeboat before the LUXBOROUGH Galley sank, but in their panic, they grabbed almost no supplies, no water, no food, no navigation equipment. They were adrift in the Atlantic with only the clothes on their backs. The first few days were manageable, uncomfortable and scary, but survivable. Then the dehydration set in. Men started hallucinating. Some tried to drink seawater, which only hastened their deaths. Bodies began accumulating in the small boat as men died from exposure, dehydration, and despair. And then, like the DUMARU survivors decades later, these men crossed the line into something primal and horrifying. They began drinking the blood of the men who died, hoping the liquid would sustain them. When that wasn't enough, they consumed the organs, particularly the hearts and livers, believing they contained more nutrition. For 2 weeks, the survivors existed in this nightmare, watching their crewmates die one by one and then consuming their remains in a desperate attempt to stay alive. The psychological trauma must have been unimaginable, but the alternative was death. Finally, after 14 days adrift, a fishing vessel spotted the lifeboat and rescued the few men who remained alive. They were emaciated, sunburned, and mentally shattered. Only a handful of the original 22 survived, and they carried the secret of what had happened with them. Unlike the DUMARU survivors who kept their story hidden for years, the LUXBOROUGH galley incident was documented relatively quickly. The survivors apparently confessed to authorities what they'd done, and while they were pitied rather than prosecuted, the story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of sea travel. Number 1. The Trial of Richard Parker, the case that changed maritime law. On July 5, 1884, a luxury yacht called the Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic during a storm. 4 crew members escaped in a 13-foot emergency lifeboat: Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and 17-year-old Richard Parker, the cabin boy. They had almost no supplies, just 2 cans of turnips and no fresh water. They were over 1,600 miles from land, and no one knew they were missing. For days, they caught nothing. They tried drinking their own urine to stave off dehydration. Richard Parker made the fatal mistake of drinking seawater, which rapidly deteriorated his condition. By day 19, Richard was unconscious, delirious, and clearly dying. The captain called for a decision. They were all starving, all dehydrating, and the boy was going to die anyway. If they waited for him to die naturally, his body would be too contaminated by seawater to safely consume. Captain Dudley made an announcement. He was going to kill the boy, and they would drink his blood and eat his flesh to survive. Edmund Brooks objected, but Stevens agreed. With Brooks refusing to participate, Dudley took out a knife and, while saying a prayer, killed Richard Parker. For the next 4 days, the 3 survivors consumed the cabin boy's body and drank his blood. On day 24, they were spotted and rescued by a German ship. When they arrived in England, they were honest about what had happened, expecting perhaps some sympathy given the extreme circumstances. Instead, they were arrested and charged with murder. The trial became a landmark case in maritime law. The prosecution argued that necessity is not a defense for murder. You cannot kill an innocent person to save yourself, no matter how dire the circumstances. This ruling fundamentally changed how maritime law handled survival situations and created legal standards that still exist today. Richard Parker was just 17 years old when he died. His name became synonymous with the darkest aspects of survival at sea, a reminder that sometimes the ocean doesn't just kill you with storms or drowning, it forces impossible choices that destroy survivors in different ways. So there you have it, 7 true stories from the ocean that are more terrifying than any horror movie because they actually happened. These weren't legends or myths. These were real people who faced genuine life or death situations and had to make impossible choices just to see another day. What strikes me most about these stories is the randomness of survival. Some people did everything right and still didn't make it, while others made it through against astronomical odds. If you found these stories as intense as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a comment and tell me which story affected you the most. Personally, I can't stop thinking about Harrison spending 14 hours trapped underwater. Want to discover even more ocean mysteries? Click the video on screen now where we explore 15 strangest creatures found at the bottom of the sea, featuring bizarre deep-sea animals that look like they came from another planet. Some of these creatures are so strange that scientists are still trying to understand how they survive in the darkest depths of the ocean. Stay safe out there, respect the ocean, and always check your emergency equipment before setting sail.